Alrighty, let's get started. So thank you everyone for being here. We've got a really exciting session ahead. So without further ado, let's kick things off. So for those of you who don't know, Plug and Play connects the world's best startups with corporate partners to help them bring innovation and technology to market faster. And we do that in a couple of ways, or three ways, I should say. So first and foremost, we're a VC. We typically invest in over 250 companies every year, making us one of the most active VCs in the world. We also run the largest corporate innovation platform in the world with over 500 corporate partners. And to complement that, we also run accelerator programs, different industry-themed accelerator programs. So these are those industry-themed accelerator programs. So everything from sustainability to fintech and health and everything in between. And I believe today we've got participants from across different industries. This is our global footprint. As you can see, we're present in most major cities around the world, and we keep on growing. So it feels like every quarter we're adding a few more dots onto this map. But let's get started. So we have two great guests with us today, Professor Jeremy Dann and Professor Robert Bornhofen. I'll just give you a quick background about both of them. So Professor Robert Bornhofen teaches and facilitates programs on innovation strategy at Cornell University and strategic decision-making at the University of Maryland. His prior work experience includes leadership positions at IBM, Avaya, Delta Airlines, and Citibank. Professor Jeremy Dann is an award-winning case study writer and founding director of the case study program at the Greif Center for Entrepreneurial Studies at USC Marshall. He's taught classes in corporate innovation, creative problem solving, and green entrepreneurship at USC since arriving in 2013. Previously, he taught at UCLA's Anderson School of Management. And fun fact, he was also my professor when I did my MBA and taught one of my favorite classes at USC. So gentlemen, thank you for being here.
Good to be here.
Hello.
Hello to you both. Well, I just want to start off with a question so that the audience maybe can get to know you a little better. So maybe we can start with you, Jeremy. How did you end up in the field of corporate innovation, and who were your biggest influences along the way?
That one's pretty easy. It was probably in my biography, and you strategically did not read that part. But when I was an MBA at Harvard Business School in the late 90s, I took a class on innovation and was enjoying it pretty well. And in an office hours with my professor, he asked if I might want to be a research fellow with him the next year. And that's a pretty cool position there because you end up writing cases and doing some pretty high level work. And this professor wasn't that well known, but he had a book that we were reading some galley pages of in our course reader. And I agreed to work with him. And a few months after that, that book was released. It was called The Innovator's Dilemma. That professor was Clayton Christensen. And by the time, our first meeting, actually, when I started working with him, was him opening up a big box and pulling out the award for gaining the Financial Times Business Book of the Year. So his life changed a lot from that. My life changed a little, but we worked together for several years on the research front, the executive education and consulting front, independent writing projects. I started a business publication he was a contributor to. And as you know, Sharif, I announced last year in our course his passing and his great influence on me, both in the world of innovation and as trying to target being a good person.
Long journey to get here. Thanks. And Robert, what about you? How did you end up in this field? And you've worked for many companies along the way. So how did you end up in the field of innovation?
Yes, great question. The short answer is I backed into it. About 20 years ago, I was working at Citibank, and I had the credit card group, and I had about 50 developers, and someone had an idea to a problem that we didn't really know existed. And we kind of ran with it. We worked with the different business units. I remember going up to New York and having them say, "You're the first one who's ever come to us with an idea like this." To which I said, "Well, no one's ever asked us before." That's back in the days when we're all siloed, and now we're kind of working as one. But I knew back then, working with the business, working side by side, figuring things out. We had some fuzzy concepts, some notions. We worked hard. We went through the phases of innovation with prototypes and validation, and it was really exciting. It was a lot different than your traditional IT project with reams and reams of documentation and formal change control and all of that. But it was great. And at that point, 20 years ago, I thought, this is what I want to do. And that's what I've been doing ever since. It's a wonderful, wonderful thing to do.
Nice. So two very different paths, but both leading to the same place as professors teaching innovation. So moving to the kind of corporate side, as you know, we've got over 500 corporate partners, and each one of them have kind of their own approach or unique way of approaching innovation. I'd love for you to talk about some of the different approaches that you've seen when it comes to innovation. If, for example, a centralized versus a decentralized approach. Maybe Robert, we can start with you.
Sure. So I'll try to keep this brief. I know we've got a lot on our agenda today, but we all know about open innovation and closed innovation, and we all know about how innovation can be structured organizationally, kind of a centralized model or a decentralized model. And also, what I want to, and again, Jeremy's going to address this as well, but I want to focus on the different, how we do innovation. Do we look at the market? Do we look at customer needs, or do we look at technology? Where does it begin? And when I think of market readers, I think of like Hyundai, for example. They pretty much look at what the others are doing, looking at the market and customers, and they're fast followers. Okay, what Toyota does one year, they do the next, and vice versa. I look at organizations that take more of a technology focus. How can technology be used in new ways to create value? And I think of Alphabet, Google's Alphabet, for example, with their investment in basic science. I think of Tesla, all the things that Elon Musk is doing, technology focused. Build it and they will come. My background and what I lean heavily towards is more of a needs seeker approach. And this is where design thinking comes in. Really understanding your customer, understanding their needs, their frustrations, what they'd love to have, what they don't have, and really getting into it and framing that approach to really front end the whole innovation process. So I kind of lean towards a need seeker approach, and with emphasis on deep understanding of the customer.
Speaking of design thinking, Jeremy, I know you're quite the expert when it comes to design thinking. How does that play into corporate innovation?
Well, thank you. Let's say so. But I would, and as a professor, you always have to be humble that sure, that game a bit, but I always look forward to meeting the great people in the innovation world, the corporate innovation world specifically, who are living that battle of like executing design thinking projects right now. So definitely always looking forward to hearing the latest, greatest thinking in an arena like that. I would say that as I talked about my early phase of working with Clayton Christensen, then his group InnoSight. And when I put out my own shingle, so to speak, and was doing independent projects and eventually in the Bay Area, eventually started up a firm here in Los Angeles. The wave of design thinking was something I rode. So kind of the 2000s through 2010s, that was kind of at its acme. So I'd say that was a big evolution point there that a lot of people would know about. I would say in the time that I started kind of in the 2009 to 2010 timeframe to becoming a professor, what I noticed, and Robert alluded to it, of open innovation, which is not one model. There's probably 20 different models of open innovation. I, at UCLA, when I was teaching there, inherited a course that maybe had one session on open innovation of some sort and of distributed approaches to innovation. And maybe it was self-selecting. They found me or I found them. Kind of almost every speaker and every case that I kind of added to the canon, so to speak, was about more innovation pretty much. So that, and again, many models of doing that. I include employee employee empowerment models as that, and I'm sure I'll mention Adobe and kind of their employee empowerment model that set a tone for hundreds of organizations around the world. So that was definitely a key thing there on that kind of empowerment. So it could be employee empowerment. It can be outside solvers and contests and idea challenges. And a good friend, Anil Rathi, and his group that has some overlap, I think, with your group, Skilled. That's an organization I'm well familiar with, and they've spoken to my class for many years. Yeah, and again, back then, when I first started studying innovation, and who I met with in my first 5 or 6 years, primarily as an innovation consultant, was the innovation group, the 7 or 8 smart guys and gals that were in charge of solving a big organization's problems. I've seen that model, at least to my mind, still exist, but be lessened. And for them have to tap into other parts of the organization and other capabilities. And finally, that leaves me with a mantra that I'll say, I think the best companies today, they look at any innovation group as not where the innovators live, but where the innovators go. So a place that can be in service to other innovators around the organization and can help activate them, rather than people working on 4 or 5 innovation projects at a time, then aiming to hand them off.
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting point of kind of make it widespread throughout the company. So if there is a corporation who's just getting started on their innovation journey, they want to build out their roadmap, and they're just kind of building up that initial team, what kind of advice would you have for those companies?
I wonder if it might be too early for the roadmap, so to speak. I've noticed that a lot of companies do better when they try to gain some small victories to gain credibility in their organizations for innovations, because at times and in certain areas it can take on the not the best connotation, especially if it's associated with a group or someone with the title of innovation. Sometimes just by having a business card, they can have some enemies within the organization through no fault of their own. So little victories are certainly key. A program like the Adobe Kickboxing can start, but that, I would say that was more than little victories, because that was hundreds of people gaining little victories, so big victories. In our class, we have connected with Northrop Grumman, that they were in an order-taking space of mostly federal government projects, and really started to pioneer a maker lab. And they have a lot of engineers and such, but a lot of them didn't know some of the current technologies, and certainly didn't know how to do stuff like sewing and things like that. And that maker lab, with people working sometimes in their off times, et cetera, on personal projects, was a little victory that established a lot of momentum for wider victories of organization or innovation within the organization.
Yep, I remember that case well. Robert, do you agree with that approach of small wins, starting small and building out from there?
I absolutely do. And I would just add to that, having, again, this is a startup or a smaller organization starting off, is that correct?
Yeah.
So I would, certainly a framework model, but this is a people business, and Jeremy alluded to the right guys and gals, the right team, the right mindset. And it's so important, especially in established organizations. You want people to think differently, to challenge how we've always done things, be intellectually curious, real go-getters. I mean, I put so much value in the people, the leader, okay? The leader needs to be able to inspire others. They need to sell what we're trying to do and why and how. So I think leadership, and also an openness to working with other organizations, working with smaller companies, or smaller companies working with larger companies, getting familiar with that and establishing the trust. So I think between people, the staff, the leadership, the orientation towards teaming with the framework model, the different phases, how we frame problems, how we ideate, how we prove ideas through prototyping, rapid prototyping, and we validate and prove hypotheses and produce it. I think it's all really important. And then to Jeremy's point, yes, start small. He's sitting in front of a baseball stadium, so we don't swing for the fence our first time up. We just want to get on base. So then we can dream big, but let's start small. That's my advice.
Great. I believe that's a soccer stadium, if I'm not mistaken, but the analogy still works. So we've got the leadership on board, we've got our team set up, we've got our framework. What are the obstacles? And failure is a part of life, but especially true when it comes to innovation. So how can companies deal with failures and overcome them? Any takers?
I'll start it then. So Jeremy, I'll be brief, but let me just quick comparison. I talked before about the typical IT project with reams of paper and documentation, very high probability of success. We just need to execute what's already been laid out. We know the technology, we know it works. Innovation is really, many times it's an idea, a concept. It's something that I think might work. It comes from the business a lot of times, or from a customer, or from a partner, but it really hasn't been proven. So we take it and we begin to see if it's going to work. We design it. We begin to put together some increments of it. But it's a well-known fact that most innovation projects fail to meet expectations. And everywhere I've worked, I've usually the VPs, the senior leadership team come out of operations. Innovation is new to them. They're used to everything working well. And if things don't work well, then it's finger pointing. And there's nothing worse than, let me back up. So I recognize the fact that some of these innovation projects involve a lot of discovery and learning. And that by itself should be acknowledged. And I think of what Procter & Gamble does. They've got a hall of, not fame, but a hall of shame, where they recognize this and they celebrate this, and they even have a eulogy, a funeral. And the participants are talking about what they liked about the experience, what was learned, what could be applied to other projects. I think of what 3M went through with Post-it Note, what Nestle went through with Nescafe for 10 years. But a lot of what was discovered and learned eventually got used elsewhere and became blockbuster hits. So it's really, really important. If you're trying to strengthen your culture, if you want employees to be able to participate, share problems, share ideas, volunteer, get involved in hackathons and innovation challenges, then you got to be really sensitive to the fact that failure is not failure. And I make a distinction between that kind of failure and just a screw up, which no one wants. Those are failures. But if you're going through the right motions, I really think we have to be careful. Leadership needs to be able to call out those who are deserving and put them on a pedestal and celebrate what's learned.
Yeah, Jeremy, when you think about failure, how do we teach people or teach leadership at companies to embrace failure, and how do we deal with failure?
Sorry, there was some feedback. Was that for me?
Yeah.
Well, so I'm going to get to that. I wanted to kind of answer the same question he started in with. And that is, when I started my business career, I would say it was not in an era of entrepreneurship and innovation in the same way the recent decade and a half have been defined by that. So when I worked with Christensen and InnoSight and my own work, there was still people that were higher executives in organizations that were trying to be innovative, that were from an era where I would say experimentation, fail, and start again was not a mantra. So they were in companies like that. I would say that and again, it's just a cross section, and Plug and Play talks to a much bigger cross section than I haven't had as many executives, innovation managers talk to me lately about organizations being afraid to fail per se in that regard of experiments. Like where I did early in my innovation career, when we would talk with organizations about standing up innovation capabilities, or we were working with them on a certain project, and there were high executives and sometimes even the CEO in the room, there was wanting to get to Six Sigma. I mean, in kind of like 80s, 90s, that was a Six Sigma culture, right? And making sure that everything was executed to the T and that failure was not an option. Plus, in my early innovation advising career, happened to do quite a bit of healthcare, quite a bit of defense. And there was a manufacturing mentality. And of course, in healthcare, you have a do no harm mentality. And I think that led to a let's not fail mentality. I don't see it as much. I think people, if they haven't been hit up by 250 tweets about the lean startup method, if they haven't, seen the movie or the show Silicon Valley and just been more immersed in the hot tub of entrepreneurialism culture, they're probably not rising to any position where they're overseeing as much that kind of role. It probably still exists. I'm just not hearing it as much in the last 7 or 8 years.
Yep. So there's been kind of a culture shift on that front, I guess.
Yeah. And by the way, I was just reading an interesting article that we might not perceive this, but China kind of has that on steroids right now, which has really helped them catch up, not just, the manufacturing and production culture, but now an innovation and experimentation culture that looks different than ours, but they have a populace that has gone through incredible displacements and is willing to experiment with new products and new way of doing things, and probably management as well in a lot of key areas.
Interesting. Very interesting. So if we're talking about kind of innovation roadmap, something we always tell our corporate partners when they join Plug and Play is to have goals, set KPIs, have metrics. So what are the kind of the key metrics or KPIs that companies should be setting when it comes to innovation? Robert, maybe you can kick us off.
Sure. Two different views, Sharif. I look at the external view outside the organization, and also the internal view as well. And I'll be really brief. Externally, I work with my students as we go through innovation strategy, and it's really important that we identify those key variables that need to get measured. What Deming said is, what gets measured gets done. And so those, what do you want to track? What defines success? How do you know when you're successful? And how do you identify those gaps where you're not quite successful? So those variables are a telltale in terms of a roadmap, be able to go back and make it better. But internally, and most people, in my experience, within an organization being asked to work on an innovation project, they really don't know what's involved. There is no journey map. They don't really understand what the phases, the milestones, the activities, the tools, the experiences. And it's always asked of me, what's involved? What will my people, what will they be doing? And so we build journey maps, and we kind of identify those different phases and the activities. And then we also identify what we think are the moments that are going to matter, when they figure something out. And I try to plot the user sentiment, because as you know, it's not easy innovating. It's frustrating. You beat your head trying to figure something out, but when you finally figure it out, or the group figures it out, it's that light bulb goes off and your emotion goes straight up. So it's kind of a roller coaster. And so we set expectations. We're going to tell people it's going to be tough at first. We're going to get different people working together, as one team, but we want people at the end of the process, when it's all said and done, to go back and say to their office mates, their bosses, it was a great experience. It was a career-defining experience. It was tough. It wasn't easy, but man, it was exhilarating. We really got a lot done, and I go back to that culture again. I'm really big on culture. I want the whole organization to get involved. I want them to share and help advance the organization. And so again, you got an external looking at what matters outside the organization, and also internal with a roadmap for people to understand the journey.
Jeremy?
Okay, I got a lot here, but none of it really definitive. I would have to say that this is, I would say, both kind of screening metrics and standards that we're at the front end of a innovation funnel or pipeline, and the metrics along the way and the indicators. Again, the cross sections that I've interacted with, I see as incredibly underdeveloped and kind of the golden fleece of this field. And I'll give you a couple of early examples. We worked, again, early in my advising career, we worked with a healthcare company, and they had the ultimate screener, a spreadsheet essentially that anyone had to fill out if they had an idea for a new healthcare product, medical device, et cetera. And there were so many variables you needed to input that it became about the model, not about the idea, not about the concept. The debates with the finance group that held the purse strings the finance group was essentially the enabler of people entering an innovation process. And the debates were around stupid stuff rather than why should we be doing this? How does this mesh with our current corporate strengths and allows us to repurpose those strengths to a new era? What strategic options on the future does this buy us? So they had numbers discussions instead of that latter discussion, incredibly unproductive. Then we worked a couple of years later with a information technology company that was engaged in what I saw as one of the first open innovation programs that I personally interacted with in my career. And it was to work in large part with educators in the university community and some other communities. And they wanted us to help them develop a screener for pitches they got about projects that could be developed, research and other things that could be pursued. And we developed, again, it was in the milieu of Clayton Christensen, what we kind of termed the disruptometer from disruptive innovation. And we created it and it was a screen to lead them to get the things that would most put them going in another direction, that would not have them just supporting their status quo and their current products. Then we get to the actual, it was a big conference. We had developed this disruptometer, so to speak. And we get there and they had taken out 3 or 4 of our questions and put in 3 or 4 of their own or standards. And it wasn't at all disruptive anymore. They would have backed probably 80 to 90% of the same kinds of companies that years previously they would have embraced. Fast forward to today. Last week in my class, I had the incubator head of a top 10 most valuable company in the world that everyone here knows. And she said to me, can we take some class time? I'd love to bounce some ideas and get some of your students' opinions, and can we put them in great breakout groups? Awesome, awesome, awesome. And the question she asked them was, what metrics and indicators should we be using of progress in the innovation arena? So she was asking my, still fairly young MBA students that didn't have nearly as much exposure in this world, their thoughts. And so this is something that obviously them, with one of the most incredible innovation cultures in the world, is still pondering and still trying to refine.
Yeah, so again, what came up with both of you is that internal alignment and how important that is, with the finance team fighting with the innovation team and the finance team acting as the kingmakers with the purse strings. Yes, that's definitely something that I'm sure a lot of companies can relate to. But let's talk then about kind of the end process. So once you've embarked on this journey, how do you measure success? Does it just come down to a return of equity or return on investment in a monetary sense, or are there other ways that we can look at success?
Well, I'll start again. I think that's a part of what I was saying was underdeveloped and where they didn't know that as well. When you talk about success of an individual project, we had our IBM case, and it was kind of set about 15 to 17 years ago. And IBM had, I think, a good 5 years of working with what's called the Horizons model, the Horizons of Growth model. A lot of people might know that they talked more about the milestones than sheer numbers and got them away from that. But I think, again, a lot of people, Mark Randall at the Adobe, sure, they wanted some interesting, quote unquote, startup ideas. Very few of these to my knowledge, became independent, they mostly still stayed within the organization and often as features of products, et cetera. They viewed their main outcome, and I didn't know this at the beginning when we started working with them on the case that it became a very, very popular case around the world, but they had, their main output was education. The number of people that are educated and can then do their job better next year. We went in depth with Xiaomi, the Chinese smartphone company. You know, as a professor and a case writer, someone like Plug and Play, you guys have more of the tendrils out. I have more of the drilling down with the case development. But Sharif, you remember the Xiaomi program, and they developed an ecosystem program where they partnered with outsiders, made a minority investment, and then fairly tightly controlled the rollout of some ecosystem products. But even they always kind of said, you know, giving the original money and then further support, it was engineers leading it, not financial people. And it was just a feel they got along the way of whether it was still paying off. So our class really gives them A or A minus on the development of kind of every other aspect of that ecosystem program. But then a few students really start to rail on that kind of updating and measuring success along the way.
I love that approach of feeling your KPIs. I wish I could do that personally with my own job and feel if I'm doing well or not, but maybe not. Robert, what do you think about measuring success?
Yeah, great. You know, it boils down to impact, right? Financial, non-financial impact. Are you moving the needle? And one advice I give everyone who will listen is to make innovation legitimate, to make it prioritized. So when it's time to cut money, and they always go after what? Training, travel, and what else? You know, innovation, right? It's a hobby. So we got to prevent that. We got to make it relevant, and we got to tie it into we have to align it to the organizational, its vision, where it's going, where it wants to be, those strategic objectives and long-term goals. If you can position innovation, what you're going after within that space, and show the direct linkage, all of a sudden you've become a prioritized essential function. And then we look at with the goals, you know, the very specific, measurable, time-bound goals, the SMART goals. And we begin to sell innovation, sell what we can do for the organization. So I kind of look at the financial impact clearly, you know, market share, revenue, customer retention, new customers. I look internally, again, back to the people. I want to be able to get a higher and higher engagement level. To Jeremy's point, to educate people, to educate them internally, what innovation is, what their role is, how they can contribute. So I want to be able to build that up as well. And I think that's really it, though. I got internal, external again, but it's so important to legitimize innovation and show the impact. And as I said before, you know, we might to get in the Baseball Hall of Fame, it's one hit at every 3 at bats, right? Maybe, you know, it's not great, but innovation isn't much different. We really have to make, at the end of the day, we got to have a portfolio of projects. Some fail, some win, but we have to show the net is we're moving the organization forward, and we're not focused on just process improvement or efficiency, but looking at how we can change the game, what we can do differently to make a real big impact.
Great. So shifting gears from kind of the corporate side to the startup side, how have you seen the relationship between corporations and startup evolve over, say, the last decade? Robert, maybe you can start us off here as well.
Sure. Well, we've seen to your business model, we've seen a lot of hold on here. I got some good notes here, but naturally, so we've seen accelerators. We've seen large companies bring in smaller startups. We've seen how mature, older companies can get, you know, for lack of a better term, kind of fat and lazy, kind of stuck in their own ways, just kind of milking their products and they're incrementally refining them, but not really changing. We're seeing companies invest in smaller companies, working with them, but I think it's a realization that this big monolithic corporation XYZ can't do what it wants to do. It's too disruptive. We've seen how Google had created Alphabet just to kind of take that disruptive force out of the operation, to make it easier, less bureaucratic, and more risk-taking. So we're seeing this whole shift going on underway, and it's a great time to be a startup. It's a great time to be matched up with other organizations and be able to see what they can provide in terms of their core competencies, their ideas, their abilities to move swiftly. So it's a great time, and I just want to say that there are some exceptions of large companies that continue to innovate. I think of 3M, for example. Minnesota Mining and Manufacturing. No one even knows what it means. My wife has these Invisalign braces, and I thought, oh, that's interesting, but they're made by 3M. Do you know that 30% of 3M's revenue, 30%, call it a third, has to come from products that are 4 years or younger. They're forced to constantly innovate. They're forced to constantly reach out to their ecosystem that Jeremy mentioned, their ecosystem of partners, and bring in those ideas, infuse those ideas, incubate them, and be able to show a result. So that's my response to that.
That might be the best example of a metric that over decades has been given honor to. So 3M might, again, it's kind of the old school. Literally, it's the first case in my class. I didn't write it. It was written years ago, and we look at it almost as a business history case. But it's almost like an archaeological dig of what's old can be new again. And some of those might be some of the most honored metrics.
Yeah, 3M is really a shining example of kind of how to do that and have that culture-wide approach to innovation, which is, great. Jeremy, about kind of startups and interacting with startups, how have you seen that evolve with the cases that you've written, with the companies that you've spoken to?
It's evolved 100%. It's a almost 180, I think, from when I started my career looking at innovation. Our first projects, it was the question asked was always, how can I prevent from being disrupted? Then we said, no, disruption happens. Maybe it's delayed a little bit, but it's a part of, Schumpeter in a way. It's going to be a truism, and business models are going to change. And we educated them with those examples to make them more comfortable. Then it was, okay, how can I control this disruption and crush all the startups, especially that want to take me down? And we did give them some advice there, but we also wanted them to have their eyes open to acquisitions, partnering, investments, et cetera. And that portion of it, a business like yours helps take that to the next level. Corporate venture capital certainly has had a moment. I think, I haven't looked up the statistics like this year, but I think has had maybe one of its longer period of sustained being in vogue, because it's had a few cycles of going in and out of vogue. The sort of syndicated or distributed corporate venture capital model, where people are, firms are supporting multiple companies by expanding their deal flow, et cetera. We've mentioned the incubators and accelerators. And then remember, even things like idea contests and challenges are another tool to get startups or nascent startups involved with your company. And finally, and I hope we're developing this, we've had a few discussions, one interview, but I hope we develop this as a case, because it would be a very important case of making sure that engagement with startups is not a part of the natural just network, the old boys network, et cetera, that it's not just, hey, this person went to my business school, let's partner with that startup. And corporates being a part of the solution of diversifying and making those opportunities available to more people. So I am hoping we're going to be launching one with a major company in the financial space that's really opening up the diversity element as well in those partnerships with startups.
Yeah, I think finance is a really good example of that shift between kind of seeing startups when fintechs first came on the scene. It was all the banks trying to shut them down, and then over the years they kind of learned the hard way that they have to collaborate with these startups. And I think that was one of the first industries where they realized that early on. Before we move on to the Q&A in a couple of minutes, I just want to end on a question. As you're both professors teaching the next generation of business leaders, are you feeling positive about the future of innovation? And do you feel like schools are equipping students with the necessary tools to become the drivers of innovation?
I can start that, then I'll be brief. I know we're running out of time here before Q&A, but uh, I'm an optimist at heart. It's how I cope. But I actually believe that every generation is builds on what the prior one has. And so I have a couple of boys who just recently graduated from universities, and I meet with them, their friends, listen to their conversation. I'm really impressed. I look at, and I think science has been a topic of discussion now for at least the past 4 years during this whole COVID, or 2 years. And I think science has come out standing. The proof point is, it's amazing that within a very short time, we came up with a cure for, or a treatment for COVID in a very, very short time, and all across the world. And I think we've become much more global. On the last point on schools, I think more can be done. And I'm generalizing here. I did a quick Google on bachelor degrees in innovation. I got 35 hits, three in the States. Mostly, I was impressed. It was very globally distributed. I think what the trend right now is towards working adults, maybe adults whose career puts them into an innovation type environment, and they want to get a certificate. They want to be able to learn more about innovation. And I think my suggestion for the school administrators right now is to do far more than to take a look much more at work-study programs, internship programs, working side by side with their ecosystem of different industries and companies. There's so much potential there. Europe does it so well. In the States, we're still kind of in that 19th century model of, we got the summers off so we can farm. Well, none of us farm anymore. And everything's done in the classroom or on Zoom, but we need to open that up and be much more open, much more engaging.
Jeremy?
Yeah, I think I'm more optimistic over the last few years than I was over a certain period of my professordom. And it's because I do think there's, let's say I'm an American innovation professor, right? And while we embrace the international aspect, we're also trying to be of service to our community and our country. And I do think there was a period where so many people, number one, wanted to kind of be marketplaces and sell things that other produced and take their penny along the way. And I was not too enamored of those models. I wish we could do more, although fortunes have been made on that. Also, people, to the extent there was production, people kind of just always assumed, oh, offshore that production. Like, all we have to do is think of the design and the consumer need. And I do think there is more of a push to serve the holistic economy. Think about manufacturing and other models where more of the value add could be in a place like America. Also, to do things more environmentally. Also, the industries has broadened out in the last few years. I mean, there was a period where everyone was an app developer or a fashion line developer, and now I think more people are interested in food and health products and other things like that. So that is spreading out again with a social impact angle often. So feel a little better about that, and I hope we can combine that with some priorities of the government, et cetera. And again, if we have a big infrastructure program or other things like that, I hope our students find opportunities in that to do things that will be innovative and definitely of service to society.
Really interesting points, and overall I'm getting a thumbs up that we're feeling optimistic, so that's great. And we're right on time for some Q&A, so I'm just going to pull up and see what we've got. First question is from Terry. In seeking to understand the needs of the customer, do you have any suggestions on better understanding how the customer makes their decision and what they prioritize in terms of their innovation needs? Anybody want to take a stab at that?
Jeremy, you're the design thinking specialist. That's probably your question. I'd be more than glad to speak to it, but why don't you take the lead, buddy?
Well, that's what I was about to allude to. And again, it might be a little bit more of I do think there are some tech tools that can complement, or in some places be a cheaper alternative to a big design thinking project, or maybe a more expensive alternative, big data analytics program. But I think design thinking in an era of getting in the room with the customer now, that's been tough the last year and a half. So I am in the fall teaching a design thinking class, or that's a big chunk of what we do. And you can't just teach it in the same way. But by the way, I'm going to teach, and even though I'm back in the classroom, I'm going to teach ethnographic interviewing via a distance learning, because I can be in my own house, and I would show you around, but that might take too much time. But it's in a way, it's conversely easier to be in a distance learning environment and showcase an in-person tool to learn that. But I think, yeah, design thinking, ethnographic interviewing. Now, someone never gets their, is never really good at it in their first interview. So I do think it's a craft, maybe more than many other elements of business, of learning to ask those questions and debriefing after each of them to see what went well and what are some kind of tricks of the trade that led you to get that really emotional answer, that answer that isn't just like, oh, it was on the shelf in front of me in the store, so I bought it. They'll start to drive some more psychological and even emotional answers to, purchase considerations and things like that. I believe it was a colleague I worked with a bit years ago named Tony Ulwick. I believe I'm not confusing this. Talk about outcome-based an analysis based on outcomes, which was it was still based on heavy interviewing and data-based approaches, but Ulwick, I think that fellow has done a lot of writing on. I haven't spoken to him in over a decade, but it was a pretty cool approach to learn about that years ago. And I'm sure he's refined it.
Great, thank you. Question from Kelly. So do you have suggestions for essential innovation tools, other than plug and play, of course, to support the innovation team, broader organization, and the process? Is there an IT platform/software offering that you would recommend?
Well, I won't. I'll be careful not to give any commercial endorsements, and we all think highly of plug and play. So I guess that's off limits, but I certainly would mention that. But I'll be generic. So one of the tools that we used was at IBM at the time, but we used it was so important to crowdsource. So we had a global population of employees and sellers. We had challenges that there was no other way to connect with them but to be able to use this tool, and it was crowdsourcing. And there was a lot that went into it, but we were able to be able to display the ideas and the metadata about those ideas, the team, the concepts, and one idea leads to another idea, and pretty soon you start connecting the dots and you get these super ideas. And I saw the ideas just propagate across the world. We had over a couple hundred ideas. Now, most innovation teams are pretty small, handful. And we weren't subject matter experts in all these different areas. So the other half of that, the other part of that tool was kind of like a crowdfunding portion. We gave every registered user $2,000, like Monopoly money, play money, but they felt like angel investors. they felt empowered to not just do thumbs up or I like this, but they were able to invest their money and spread it around. And we were able to see the ideas start the really good ones, rise to the top like cream above milk. And we could not have done this. We could not have reached out to 13,000 employees within a short time period and be able to harvest fantastic ideas that grew on top of each other and be able to recognize the people behind those ideas and come up with what were the top 10%, which we then applied due diligence. So, and again, that was so important to frame the right challenge with the best ideas from which we can then look at those top ideas to see which ones were worth or prototyping. But we couldn't have done it without a tool like that. And there's many, many out there that do similar type functionality.
Jeremy, maybe you want to click on kickboxing for a second, because that sounds a lot like the Adobe model.
I couldn't hear it because of feedback, but I think you mentioned kickbox. I have something about that. I will tell you an interesting little anecdote. I did a case. It's really hard to teach now because it's kind of outdated, on Bloomberg Sports and them trying to become, or excuse me, Bloomberg trying to become more entrepreneurial. And then they started using their analytics platforms for fantasy sports and for professional sports management. But they told an anecdote about the way Bloomberg was kind of innovating and hoping to surface innovation ideas. And it was via a chat room just on the Bloomberg terminal. So if you have a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. And the day I logged into that innovation chat group with the people we were profiling in the case, the number one trending item by a long shot, 10x, 20x, anything else, was someone with an idea for a new app to share half sandwiches in the cafeteria. That, like, can we match people that show up in our cafeteria at Bloomberg, and I have a roast beef and you have a turkey, and we could trade half sandwiches? And it didn't look like it was accomplishing their goals. So there are better ways. Adobe, it's a little unfortunate that I wasn't able to get the schedule till later this week. I believe it's tomorrow or Friday. I am talking with the person that took over the kickboxing platform. So Adobe, with their blessing, kind of passed on a lot of the, I think, the IP and the copyrights to an international organization for it to be crowdsourced. So I'm looking forward to learning tomorrow the new directions that has gone and what different techniques and what different technology to kind of expand the outreach different people have done with Kickbox. Also with people, I mentioned them, the Skilled platform for reaching out specifically to civilians and students. And it's used limited in what Plug and Play does of reaching out to more of the startups and whatnot, but this is more or quite a bit more diffuse. That's a good tech for reaching those groups.
I like the sandwich sharing idea. I think I might try and get that started at Plug and Play.
You're the only one at your cafeteria at home. I mean, who are you going to share with?
I got an interesting question here, as you're both educators. So about education on innovation, shouldn't every degree from engineering to business include innovation methods to some extent, instead of running an innovation specific kind of bachelor class or degree?
I can start, and I define there's so many different definitions of innovation, right? Everyone's got a different take on it. And I break it down to fundamentals. It's nothing more. I mean, 20 years ago, my Citibank example, the term innovation really wasn't used in that context. It was just old-fashioned solving the right problem, okay? Solving the right problem with an idea, a great idea that has never been done before, or at least for that organization, that has tremendous value behind it, and that we can begin to work with that idea and make it and see if it will work. Actually, if everything works, and then be able to roll it out. And so you can apply that basic definition to engineering or many different sciences. Engineering is a lot of times about how to solve a problem, how to go about engineering a solution. So I think it really, and you do see innovation and entrepreneurial studies in different colleges as well for that same reason. It's that same type of mindset. So I do see a good play for that. My son just finished up at the University of Georgia. His degree was in cognitive science. That was not in the business program. That was in a different program. So you're starting to see some crossing over.
Well, in degrees from business to engineering, a lot of people wouldn't view that as a big swath of the university system. And there's, at a place like USC, there's everything from, you know, the film school to School of Social Work and dance. So there's a way broader swath than what was just mentioned. My first inclination was no, that even as a professor of innovation, that like, look, I think there's been a talk about right sizing the education for different individuals, depending on the role they want to have in society. And for some degrees to be more 2-year degrees, associate's degrees, trade orientation. So I'm not 100% sure that everyone needs to be embracing that in that way. I had a very interesting discussion yesterday with a lawyer who also he's an adjunct professor. And he was talking about the shrinking number of people, even as the university system grows, how many people are in kind of the Academy of Scholars? And so I really wonder that. And I wonder what that means is how many people are having, you know, lunchtime, midnight debates in dorm rooms versus going home and looking forward to applying their craft as soon as possible. So I do think that broader discussion, since that's top of mind with just a lunch I had yesterday, impacts that. But then I also started thinking a role in society, like the university's role in its society, and in American society, we want people to be questioning, not to be order takers, to be innovative. So I do think while I don't know if it's a requirement that someone take an innovation class, I think it's an encouragement that more and more faculty have aspects of questioning, of debating, and things like that. You know, it's unfortunate. I think we should. We don't have an ethics requirement as a course at USC Marshall, but all professors are encouraged to have a session on ethics, which we do in our course with a session on the ethics of autonomous driving innovation. So I guess it's maybe a little bit parallel. I hope more people are integrating it in, but should there be a requirement? Don't know.
Interesting. Well, I think we probably don't have time to get into another question. I want to thank you both very much. I hope we can have you back again sometime to answer some more questions, because I have plenty of more questions, and unfortunately we didn't manage to address even half of the questions from the audience. So thank you very much for being here. Just want to note for the audience that we'll be launching a poll after we wrap up. So just we'd appreciate if you could fill that in. But thank you very much for being here. I hope you have a great day and a great week.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.